You think you can use this hand to ruin me? Sloane Ashcroft hissed the words through clenched teeth, and in that narrow medication room under the hard white light, the needle in her hand caught the glare just once. Marin Doyle stumbled back, her spine striking the edge of the medical refrigerator. The prescription slip flew from her fingers, turned a slow circle in the air, and landed face down on the floor. The steel tray slid off the counter, and a storm of metal and glass came down on the tile, the sound tearing through the quiet of that house and running the length of the hallway all the way to the side door. Outside the window, the Chicago snow was falling so thick the whole city seemed to have been muffled. She meant to scream, but what left her throat was only a short, dry sound that broke apart halfway out. Then her forearm went cold. There was no pain, and that was the worst part of it, only a chill running from her wrist to her elbow, and then 5 fingers that would no longer obey her. She looked down at her own hand the way a person looks at some strange object someone has set on her body. That hand had stitched 14 sutures into a man on a night when the storm shut down every road. That hand had spooned broth into the mouth of an old woman who could not speak. That hand was earning, dollar by dollar, the surgery her younger brother was waiting for back in Ohio. And that hand had just been reminded it did not belong to her. Sloane was breathing hard. She bent down, picked up the prescription slip, folded it once, and slid it into the pocket of her white coat. When she leaned in close again, her voice had gone soft, the same voice she used to calm a patient right before she picked up a blade. Tomorrow you'll say you dropped it. You were careless. You were tired. Because if you say anything else, I'll say you've been taking her medication. And you tell me between a doctor and a nurse buried in debt, who do you think the board is going to believe? That was when the side door opened. Neither woman had heard the engine in the drive. Neither had heard the key. The man standing in that doorway was not supposed to set foot in this city until late that night. But there he was, snow still resting on the shoulders of his black wool coat, car keys still in his hand, his eyes settling first on the broken glass across the floor, and then moving slowly up to Marin's wrist. There were maybe 300 people in that city who knew who Cormac Fallon was, and not one of them had ever seen him lose his temper. People said that was precisely why they were all still breathing. Today would be the first time. But to understand what truly happened in that room, we have to go back to the night Marin Doyle first walked through the iron gates of the Fallon house, carrying one worn suitcase, one nursing license, and a debt she had never spoken of to a living soul. If this story reached you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with whoever came to mind, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the rest. Many winters before that day in the medication room, in Chicago's West Loop, there was an Italian restaurant that had turned off its sign early, but kept the lights burning for exactly one table. The season's first snow drifted lightly beyond the glass, thin and wet, not yet strong enough to cover the street, only enough to make the warm, yellow light inside the restaurant look more comforting than it truly was. The last waiter had gone home long ago. The kitchen had gone cold. In that wide, empty room, only 2 men remained seated across from each other, while a third stood with his back against the doorframe, his hands folded in front of his stomach, saying nothing for the entire evening. The man with his back to the door was named Cormac Fallon. He wore a black wool coat, and no jewelry except for a tarnished silver ring on his ring finger, and he was cutting the meat on his plate slowly, as though this were the most ordinary dinner in the world. The man sitting across from him hadn't managed to eat a single bite. His name was Halloran, the owner of a small freight company that ran routes through the port. More than half his hair had gone gray, and his shirt had darkened beneath both arms, even though the restaurant wasn't warm at all. On his last 3 shipments, he had underreported the weight. He thought no one had noticed. He had believed that for nearly a year, Cormac set down his knife and fork, wiped the corner of his mouth with his napkin, then picked up the wine bottle and filled the other man's glass, before pouring his own. It was the gesture of a thoughtful host. Halloran watched the wine stream into his glass, and his throat went dry. "Do you know why I like this place?" Cormac said, his voice low and even, without the slightest edge of anger. "Because they don't change the menu. 20 years, and it's still the same dishes. People keep thinking change is a sign of progress. I think the opposite. If something is good, you leave it alone." Halloran nodded, because he didn't know what else to do. "You and your wife have a little place in Bridgeport too, don't you?" Cormac continued in the same voice. "Your wife makes a very good stew. I've heard people praise it. I bought that building last week. The whole row, not just your unit." The restaurant was so quiet that they could hear the snow touching the glass. Halloran opened his mouth, then closed it again. There are moments when a person understands something without anyone having to say it plainly, and that understanding comes very quickly, like missing a step on a staircase in the dark. Cormac said nothing more about it. He simply slipped one hand inside his coat, took out a light brown envelope, and pushed it across the table with 2 fingers, slowly, until it came to rest beside the untouched plate in front of the other man. "That's the transfer agreement for your freight company," he said. "The price I'm paying is a little above market value. I don't like squeezing a man so hard that he has nothing left to move forward with." Halloran pulled out the contract. His hands were trembling so badly that the rustle of the paper sounded unnaturally loud. He read it, or pretended to read it, because in a moment like that, no one could truly make sense of a single word. Then he looked up, and the expression in his eyes belonged to a man about to ask whether there was another way. Cormac didn't look away. He didn't answer either. He only placed a pen on the table, its point facing the other man, then sat in silence and waited with the patience of someone who had the entire evening in his hands. Halloran signed. His signature was shaky and smaller than usual, as though even his own hand were trying to make itself smaller so the pain might hurt less. Cormac lifted the paper, blew lightly over the ink to dry it, folded it, and slipped it back inside his coat. Then he stood, fastened the buttons of his coat one by one with quiet precision, and before turning away, he took out his wallet and laid enough cash on the table to pay for the entire meal of the man who had just lost everything into his hands. "Eat," he said. "Food this good shouldn't be wasted just because it's gone cold." Outside, Beckett Shaw already had the car door open and was waiting with both hands in his coat pockets. The snow had thickened since they went inside, whitening the shoulders of both men during the short walk from the restaurant door to the curb. Cormac settled into the back seat and looked through the fogged glass toward the bright restaurant window, where the other man was still sitting motionless before his plate. That was Cormac Fallon in those earlier winters. A man who had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to explain himself, and never encountered a situation without knowing exactly what he was supposed to do next. Only a few winters later, that same man would stand frozen in the middle of a cramped room, broken glass scattered across the floor around him, and for the first time in his life, he wouldn't know what to do with his own 2 hands. The living room in the Fallon house was so large that a voice seemed to echo for a while before finally fading away. Maren Doyle sat on the edge of her chair with her knees together, a folder resting on her lap, the one she had spent the entire previous week arranging with meticulous care. The man sitting across from her wasn't the owner of the house. He was in his 50s, his neatly combed hair silver at the temples, his gray suit tailored so precisely that it seemed almost like part of his body. He introduced himself as Everett Kane, the family's attorney, and he said it in the manner of a man who had repeated those words thousands of times and no longer needed to think about them. His voice was warm and unhurried, carrying something in it that made people want to trust him. He poured tea for her before pouring his own, exactly as a kind uncle in a respectable family might have done. "Make yourself comfortable," he said. "This isn't a courtroom." Maren opened the folder, intending to explain her nursing certification, her 2 years in intensive care, and the rehabilitation training program she had left unfinished. Everett Kane glanced at the first page, then set the entire folder aside without reading further. "Everyone has credentials," he said. "I want to hear something else." He rested one elbow on the arm of his chair, laced his fingers together, and asked about the student loan she still owed. She answered. Then he asked about the second loan, the one she had signed for after leaving graduate school. She answered again, and this time her voice was slightly quieter. He asked about her younger brother. She told him Wyatt was 19, living with their aunt in Ohio, and needed spinal surgery that the insurance company had refused to cover twice. He asked why they had refused. She said they had classified the surgery as lacking sufficient medical necessity. He nodded slowly, like a man who genuinely felt sorry for her. Then he asked when the accident had happened, and Maren heard herself telling the story as though it belonged to someone else. An autumn afternoon on the highway outside Columbus, a truck lost its brakes on a downhill stretch of road. Her parents died at the scene. Wyatt survived but never stood again, and she abandoned her master's degree during her final semester because there was no one else left in the family who could go to work. She told the whole thing in 4 sentences and added nothing more, because she had learned that if she spoke any longer, people would begin looking at her with pity, and she couldn't bear that. Everett Kane remained silent for just long enough. "Do you know what I'm looking for here?" he said. "There are plenty of talented people out there. This family doesn't lack the money to hire talented people. What this house needs is someone who knows how to keep her mouth shut. He said it in the same warm voice he had used before, and Marin, sitting in the middle of that enormous room with the now useless folder on her lap, mistook it for a compliment. She understood it to mean that a nurse's discretion was valued, that this family cared deeply about privacy, that she had been recognized for a quality no school could ever certify. She nodded and said she understood. Everett Kane smiled, rose to his feet, and told her to follow him upstairs. At the end of the second-floor hallway was a room with a large window overlooking the back garden. The room smelled of clean linens and something else so faint it was almost no smell at all, the kind of scent only people who worked in caregiving recognized as the smell of a body that hadn't left the house in a very long time. Rosalind Fallon sat in a chair beside the window, a thin blanket spread across her legs. The entire right side of her body was still, her right hand resting palm up on her lap like something someone had set there and forgotten. But her eyes weren't still at all. They were the eyes of a woman who remained alert enough to judge every person who entered her room. And in that moment, Marin had the strange feeling that she was the one being truly interviewed. Everett Kane introduced her in a few brief sentences, his voice still warm, then stepped back and stood beside the door. Rosalind didn't answer him. She looked at Marin for a long time, long enough that Marin had to make herself stand perfectly still and resist the urge to raise a hand and smooth her hair. She smiled and greeted her. Rosalind kept looking at her a little longer. Then she turned her face toward the window, where the bare branches outside were moving gently in the wind, and she didn't look at Marin again for the rest of that afternoon. The Fallon house had a rhythm of its own, and it took Marin about 2 weeks to learn it by heart. She woke before daylight, went downstairs to boil water, prepared the morning medication tray, and checked every compartment again in the exact order she had established for herself. At 7 o'clock, she went up to Rosalind's room and opened the curtains halfway instead of all the way, because she had noticed the older woman squinted when the light came in too quickly. She took her blood pressure, recorded it in the logbook, then sat down in the low chair beside the bed and began the part of her work that no one in that house had ever assigned to her, but that she did every single day. She read aloud to her. At first it was the weather pages from the newspaper, then the letters to the editor, and gradually it became anything she happened to find on the bookshelf in the hallway. As she read, she would stop at simple words and repeat them slowly, leaving a silence long enough in case Rosalind wanted to try. For many days, she didn't. She only looked out the window, or closed her eyes, or stared at her motionless right hand, the way people look at something broken that they still can't bring themselves to throw away. Then one morning, when Marin tilted a cup closer to her lips, Rosalind managed to force out a sound, water. The word was dry and distorted, barely shaped at all, but Marin understood it, and her hand stopped in midair. 3 days later came the second word, cold, spoken when the wind slipped through the crack around the window. The third took much longer, and it was the name of her son, Cormac, imperfectly pronounced but impossible for anyone to mistake. 3 words. For a long stretch of time, there were only those 3, and Marin wrote all 3 into the care log in neat handwriting as though they were laboratory results. But something else happened at the end of every afternoon, and Marin never recorded it because she didn't know how. When the light beyond the garden began turning gray, Rosalind would grow restless. She would extend her left hand, open her palm, and make a brief motion in the air, the kind of gesture anyone would understand immediately. She wanted a pen. The first time it happened, Marin gave her a ballpoint pen and a blank sheet of paper from her own notepad. Rosalind held the pen in her left hand, her non-dominant hand, her fingers curling around it clumsily like those of a child just learning how to hold one. She pressed the tip against the paper and began to draw. What she drew wasn't writing. It was a spiral, crooked and uneven, darker in some places and lighter in others, the trembling lines crossing over one another in the center, before widening outward in a lopsided shape. She drew slowly, very slowly, and as she worked, her jaw clenched tight. When she finished, she let go of the pen, released a long breath, then stared at the page for a long while before looking up at Marin. Marin didn't understand any of it. She told Rosalind it was a beautiful drawing, using the gentle voice people so often used with patience. And the instant the words left her mouth, she saw something go dark in Rosalind's eyes. Rosalind turned her face toward the window. The next day, at exactly the moment the light began turning gray, she held out her hand again. And the next day, and the day after that. Mrs. Delaney, the older housekeeper who had worked in the Fallon home for nearly 15 years, once stood in the doorway watching and shook her head. She told Marin that the previous nurse had put all the pens away. She said the ink got on the sheets, got on the sleeves, and wouldn't come out no matter how many times they washed them, while the old woman kept drawing and drawing without making anything that looked like anything, doing nothing but making more work for everyone else. She said that after the pens were taken away, Rosalind had been restless for about a week, then stopped, and things had been easier for everyone after that. Marin listened, nodded, and thanked Mrs. Delaney for telling her. Then, that afternoon, when Rosalind held out her hand, Marin still placed the pen in her left palm. She didn't know exactly why she did it. There was only one simple thought in her mind, that if there was still one thing in this world the old woman could do by herself, Marin wasn't the person who had the right to take it away. So at the end of every afternoon she gave her a pen, gave her a sheet of paper, and sat quietly in the low chair until Rosalind finished drawing. Some days she drew only one shape. Some days she drew 2 or 3 on the same sheet, layered over one another. Some days her hand shook so badly that the lines broke apart, and she would push the page away and demand another. The sheets kept multiplying. At first Marin clipped them into the care binder, but within a week the binder had grown so thick it wouldn't close. She thought about throwing them away, and she truly did pick up the whole stack once and stand beside the kitchen trash can for a while. Then she stopped herself. Throwing them away didn't feel right. It felt like throwing away something that belonged to another person, something she had no right to decide the fate of. In her room, she had an old shoebox filled with odds and ends, receipts, letters, Wyatt's insurance papers. She emptied everything into a cloth bag, wiped the box clean, and began storing the drawings inside it. She pushed the box beneath her bed, and every night before going to sleep, she pulled it out once to place that day's sheet inside. That night, the blizzard had shut down every road leading out of the city, and Marin woke not to the sound of the wind but to the side door slamming too hard somewhere downstairs. She pulled a sweater over her pajamas, went barefoot down the stairs, and when she stepped into the dining room, the chandelier overhead was blazing at full brightness, that warm yellow light no one in the house ever turned on at such an hour. Beckett Shaw was helping Cormac Fallon into a chair. His black wool coat had been removed and draped over the back of the chair beside him, and the left sleeve of his shirt had been torn open from the shoulder down. 2 other men stood in the hallway, snow still clinging to their shoes, and neither of them said a word. Marin stopped for exactly 1 beat in the doorway. There were many questions in her mind at that moment, and she left every one of them there. She asked only one thing, in the calm voice of someone already at work, where the medical kit was kept. Beckett pointed toward the cabinet beneath the stairs. She went to get it, washed her hands at the kitchen sink longer than usual, spread a clean towel across the polished oak dining table, then told Cormac to place his arm on it. He looked at her for a moment before doing as she asked. "No one in this house is calling a doctor," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Cormac answered. "Not tonight." She nodded and said nothing more. She cleaned the wound, disinfected it, opened the suture packet, and threaded the needle beneath the chandelier light. She worked slowly and evenly, each stitch spaced the same distance apart, her fingers so steady that even she found it strange, because her heart was beating much faster than her hands revealed. Cormac didn't make a sound. He sat with his back straight, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall ahead of him, and perhaps he was counting just as she was. The 3 men in the hallway stood motionless and watched. No one entered the room, no one asked questions, no one took out a phone. Throughout the entire house there was only the wind striking the windows and the small snip of the scissors cutting thread, once after every stitch, until the 14th, when Marin stopped, set the scissors down, and said she was finished. She bandaged the wound, told him to keep it dry for 2 days, and told him that if he developed a fever or the area became hot, he had to tell her immediately, no matter what time it was. He asked when the stitches should come out. She said 10 days. That was everything they said to each other that night. She cleaned up, wrapped everything she had used in a separate bag, wiped the table twice until the polished oak showed no trace of what had happened there, then carried the waste bag out through the back door. When she returned, the dining room lights were off, and no one remained in the house. The next morning, while she was preparing the morning medication tray in the kitchen, Cormac walked in. He had changed his clothes, his left arm held slightly closer to his body, and his face gave no indication whether he had slept at all. He placed an envelope on the kitchen counter. For last night, he said. Marin looked at the envelope, then at him. She dried her hands on a towel, picked it up, and pushed it back toward him in exactly the way someone would return an object that had been left in the wrong place. "I don't take extra money for something anyone trained in this work would have done," she said. "You already pay me. That's enough." He didn't take it right away. He looked at her longer than necessary, and in that moment something shifted almost imperceptibly in the way he stood. The way a man accustomed to believing that everything in the world had a price suddenly found himself facing something that didn't. He took the envelope back and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he thanked her. Just those 2 words. And he said them in the voice of a man who rarely had reason to use them. He turned and walked away. At the far end of the hallway, Everett Kane was standing with a cup of coffee in his hand, his gray suit jacket buttoned neatly, even though it was far too early for anyone to have arrived for work. How long he had been standing there, no one knew. He didn't enter the kitchen. He simply watched Cormac disappear around the bend of the staircase, then slowly turned his gaze back and let it rest for a long time on the woman standing beside the kitchen counter with the morning medication tray in her hands. Then he took a sip of coffee and walked toward the study. Sloane Ashcroft moved into the house on Astor Street one March afternoon, when the snow had already begun melting into dirty water along both sides of the road. She was 31 years old, with platinum blonde hair cut sharply at her chin, as though someone had measured the line with a ruler, and she came through the front door with 3 suitcases carried by other people, her red lips perfectly outlined, even though it was only a little past noon. She owned a cosmetic clinic on Michigan Avenue, and within the first 2 sentences she spoke to Marin, she had already found a way to mention it once. That evening, 4 people sat down to dinner at the large dining room table, the same oak table where only a few weeks earlier Marin had spread out a clean towel. Everett Kane arrived carrying a bottle of wine, and sometime during the meal he told the story of how the 2 of them had met, telling it the way people tell a small amusing anecdote. He said the fundraiser that night had been so dull he had nearly gone home early, but then he saw Cormac standing alone in the corner of the room, like a statue, and he thought surely he couldn't let the boy stand there like that all evening. He said all he had done was guide the young doctor past him, make a single introduction, then wander off somewhere else to drink. He laughed. Sloane laughed. Cormac shook his head and said his uncle had already taken credit for that story 4 times. The whole thing passed in less than a minute. Then everyone moved on to something else, and no one at that table held on to it in their mind. Marin was clearing plates, and she didn't hold on to it either. During the first few weeks, Sloane treated her with a warmth that left Marin slightly uncomfortable. In front of Cormac, she would place a hand on Marin's shoulder and say that Miss Doyle was the treasure of this house, that without Miss Doyle, Rosalind wouldn't have spoken a single word again. Cormac heard those things and felt relieved, because he had worried that the 2 women most important to his daily life might have difficulty getting along, and apparently they didn't. But there were things that happened when he wasn't there. One morning, Marin went down to the medication room as usual and found that the access code to the medicine cabinet had been changed. She stood there for a few seconds and tried again because she thought she had entered it incorrectly, then went to ask and was told that Dr. Ashcroft had changed the code the night before for safety reasons. That afternoon, Sloane gave her the new code written on a small slip of paper, along with a smile. She said too many people came and went through the house, and someone in her profession couldn't simply leave a medicine cabinet as open and accessible as a cupboard full of dishes. Marin nodded and said the doctor was right. She slipped the paper into the pocket of her uniform. Then one afternoon, while Marin was updating the care log at the small table in Rosalind's room, Sloane walked in carrying a blood pressure monitor. She said she wanted to check on her future mother-in-law herself, speaking in the voice of a thoughtful daughter-in-law, and she pulled up a chair beside her. Rosalind was looking out the window. Sloane pushed up her sleeve and reached for her left wrist, the wrist on the side of her body that could still move, and Rosalind pulled her hand away. It wasn't a startle. It wasn't the reflex of someone touched without warning. Rosalind lifted her left hand, placed it against Sloane's wrist, and pushed it away. It was a slow, deliberate, unmistakably intentional movement from beginning to end. The movement of someone still clear-minded enough to decide who was allowed to touch her. Then she turned her face away. The room remained silent for about 3 breaths. Sloane still had the smile on her face, but the smile had stopped moving. It stayed there, perfectly shaped, perfectly curved, her red lips still flawless, but there was nothing behind it anymore, and it remained frozen that way for more than half a second longer than a real smile ever could. Marin was sitting slightly behind them, still holding her pen, and she saw all of it. Then Sloane stood up, folded the monitor away, and said Rosalind was probably tired today, and they could try another time. She walked out of the room at an unhurried pace. Marin lowered her eyes to the logbook in front of her and realized she had been sitting there all that time with one word left unfinished on the page. That spring, something happened that no one in that house had dared to hope for, not even Marin. Rosalind began to improve. 3 words became 4 in the final week of March, when she managed to say pain as Marin turned her shoulder a little too quickly. The 5th word came on a sunny morning, and it was open, spoken while she looked toward the closed window. Then everything began moving faster. The 6th and 7th words came only a few days apart, and by the middle of April, Marin had stopped counting because she could no longer keep up. Rosalind began putting 2 words together. Cold water. Open it. Not right. Those last 2 words became the ones she used most often, and she used them at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, with a precision that made Marin turn her face away more than once to hide what was showing there. Her body began keeping pace. Her left hand, once strong enough only for brief movements, could now hold things longer and more firmly. One afternoon, Marin set a handled cup of water on the small table beside the bed as she always did, then turned away to get a towel. When she turned back, Rosalind was lifting the cup and drinking from it by herself. No trembling, no spilling. When she finished, she placed the cup back exactly where it had been, then looked at Marin with an expression Marin would remember for a very long time. The look of someone who had just reclaimed one small thing the entire world had already decided was gone forever. That night, Marin sat on the edge of her bed in her room. It was well past midnight outside, and she called Wyatt. The phone rang for a long time before he answered. His voice was thick with sleep and alarm, and he immediately asked what was wrong. She said nothing was wrong. Then she told him, and once she started she didn't stop, telling him about the 4 new words that week, telling him how the old woman had lifted the cup by herself, telling him how she knew to say not right exactly when someone said something wrong. She spoke so quickly that even she could hear the tremble in her own voice. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Wyatt laughed and told her she was completely crazy, calling him at 2 o'clock in the morning just to brag about an old woman drinking water. Then his voice softened, and he said, "If you did it, then you did it. Don't make it smaller like you always do." Marin ended the call and sat in the darkness for a while longer, the phone still warm in her palm. But the morning that changed the whole house came near the end of April. Marin was helping Rosalind practice naming familiar objects, and she placed a small framed photograph in front of her, one that always sat on the bedside table. In the picture, a man was standing slightly turned in front of the porch of an old house. Marin asked who it was. Rosalind stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she spoke. And this time the word came out whole and clear. Perfectly formed, not distorted, not broken by breath, so distinct that the final sound seemed to strike the room like a knock at the door. Cormac. Somewhere in the hallway, footsteps stopped. Cormac Fallon was standing there, still holding the coat he had just taken off, and no one knew how long he had been listening. Marin saw him through the opening of the door. She saw that he didn't come in. She saw him lift one hand and grip the doorframe so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Then he turned his face away, turning his whole body toward the wall across the hall, and he stood there for a long time with his shoulders trembling slightly, the posture of a man trying to pull something back inside after it had already escaped. He didn't enter the room. He walked straight downstairs, and it wasn't until that evening that he said a single thing to Marin, that he had heard it. 3 days later, Everett Kane came to visit. He brought flowers and a box of pastries, asked Mrs. Delaney about her knees, and called Marin Kiddo the way he always did. Then he went upstairs to Rosalind's room and stayed beside her bed for a very long time, longer than all his previous visits put together. He held her left hand and told stories from years ago, stories about her husband, his voice warm and slow. Rosalind looked at him. She didn't say a word. When he came back into the hallway, he stopped beside Marin and asked about her progress in the voice of a concerned uncle. He asked how many words Rosalind could say now. He asked how long her left hand could hold an object. He asked how many therapy sessions she did each day, and which one was the time when Rosalind was most alert. He asked, at this rate, how long it might be before she could speak a full sentence. Marin answered everything honestly and completely, because she was proud of those numbers. Everett Kane took a small leather-bound notebook from the pocket of his suit jacket and wrote them down. When he finished, he closed the notebook and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He smiled at her. Then he left. By the end of May, everything began moving in the opposite direction. It started with the afternoon session. Rosalind lifted the cup halfway, then had to set it back down, and water sloshed across the tabletop in a spreading stain. Marin wiped it away and told her she was tired today, that they would try again tomorrow. The next day, she couldn't lift it either. Then her hand began to tremble. A small, steady tremor in her left hand. Something that had never been there before. She began sleeping longer. She slept until noon, and when she woke, it took a long while for her eyes to catch up with the room around her. The language sessions grew shorter because she could no longer follow them. By the second week, the 2-word phrases disappeared. Then the single words began falling away as well, the ones gained most recently disappearing first. And one afternoon, Marin held up the framed photograph from the bedside table and asked her who it was. Rosalind stared at the picture for a long time, her lips moving soundlessly, and nothing came out. She closed her eyes and turned her face toward the wall. Marin remained sitting in the low chair until the room had gone completely dark. For the next 2 weeks, she blamed herself in every way a person in her profession knows how to blame herself. She thought she had pushed the progress too quickly. She thought she had allowed Rosalind to become exhausted without noticing, that she had become so eager to see results that she had forgotten her age, that she had allowed herself to celebrate too soon something she should have known was fragile. She shortened the sessions, lengthened the rest periods, took her blood pressure more often throughout the day, and recorded everything in the logbook. But Rosalind continued slipping backward, steadily, without stopping. And one day when Marin helped her sit up, she couldn't hold her head upright for more than a few minutes. That night, Marin didn't sleep. She sat at the small desk in her room with the care log open in front of her, and she finally did what she should have done 2 weeks earlier. She went back and read everything from the beginning instead of looking only at the most recent pages. She traced every day, every session, every entry. She went back 3 months, then compared the notes against the prescription sheets clipped inside the back cover. On the 4th page, her hand stopped. The number on the evening medication line had been altered. The whole line hadn't been rewritten. Only that one number had been changed, written directly over the old mark. She turned another page. There was another alteration on the prescription sheet from the previous month. Then another. Then she laid all the pages side by side beneath the desk lamp and looked at them together. And the thing that had been sitting in plain sight for weeks became so clear that a chill ran down her spine. The altered numbers hadn't been written by the same person. Rosalind's attending physician wrote with a rightward slant. The letters separate. The number 7 crossed through the middle in the habit of someone educated in Europe. But the numbers written over the originals stood straight upright, drawn in continuous strokes, with the tops of the numerals lifting slightly at the end. Different handwriting. A different hand. And when Marin checked the dates, she found something else that disturbed her even more. The changes weren't scattered randomly. The first one appeared in the final week of April. She sat with that thought for a very long time. The final week of April was the week Rosalind had managed to say her son's name. Marin took out her phone, pulled the prescription sheet into the center of the light from the desk lamp, and took a picture. It came out blurred. She took another. Still blurred. Then she realized her hand was shaking, and she had to brace both elbows against the desk to hold the phone steady before the 3rd photograph finally came out clear. She photographed every page, then sat for a while longer watching the screen slowly dim in her hand. She would tell Cormac. She made that decision before dawn, and she repeated it to herself many times throughout the following day, the way a person repeats a promise they have made to themselves. But by afternoon, hurried footsteps were moving through the house. Something had happened in Detroit. A shipment had been held. A meeting couldn't be postponed. Beckett already had the car waiting outside the gate. Cormac came down the stairs with his coat draped over one arm, gave Mrs. Delaney a few instructions, and said something brief to Beckett about the flight time. Then he reached the side door and stopped. He turned and looked back at Marin, who was standing at the end of the hallway with a tray in her hands. "Is something wrong, Miss Doyle?" he asked. 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Marin could hear the grandfather clock in the living room, the engine of the car outside, even the sound of herself swallowing. In those 3 seconds, she thought about the photographs on her phone, thought about the fact that she was only a hired nurse, thought about the fact that the person she would be accusing was a doctor who was about to become his wife, thought about the second loan, thought about the day her aunt had called to say the hospital in Ohio had finally scheduled Wyatt's surgery, and Marin had been able to tell her, "I'll take care of it." In those 3 seconds, she told herself that waiting until he came back wouldn't be too late. "Nothing, sir," she said. "Have a safe trip." He nodded and stepped outside. The side door closed behind him, and Marin Doyle would carry those 3 seconds with her for the rest of her life. On the second night after Cormac left for Detroit, the alarm in Rosalind's room went off sometime after midnight. Marin was awake before her mind had fully caught up with the sound, and she was already halfway down the hallway while Mrs. Delaney was still fumbling for the light switch at the top of the stairs. In the room, Rosalind was lying on her side, her skin cold and damp, her breathing so shallow that her chest barely seemed to rise. Marin pressed 2 fingers to the pulse in her neck, counted, then reached up and switched on the main light and told Mrs. Delaney to call an ambulance immediately. And once she had called, to open the front gate and turn on every light outside. Mrs. Delaney hurried into the hallway, her hands shaking so badly that she had to dial twice before getting the number right. Marin lifted Rosalind's chin to straighten her airway, placed a pillow beneath her shoulders, checked her pupils, and all the while she kept talking, calling her name, telling her to stay there with her, telling her all she had to do was breathe, that she didn't have to do anything else. The bedroom door opened. Sloane Ashcroft came in wearing a silk robe she had thrown on in a hurry, her hair still loose, and the moment she glanced toward the bed, her voice turned sharp and dry. She told Marin to move aside. She went straight to the small cabinet in the room, opened the lower drawer, took out a vial and a syringe, and named a dosage in the clipped, precise voice of someone accustomed to giving medical orders and accustomed to having them obeyed. She held it out toward Marin and told her to inject it. Marin didn't reach for it. In that room there was the sound of an old woman's breathing growing weaker and the ticking of the clock in the hallway. And somewhere between those 2 sounds, Marin heard her own voice, far calmer than anything happening inside her. She said no. "What did you say?" Sloane asked. "I said no," Marin answered. She already had that medication tonight. Sloane told her she was a doctor, told her this wasn't the time for an argument, told her that if anything happened to Rosalind, the person who would have to answer for it in court would be the nurse standing there, not anyone else. Marin still didn't take the syringe. She said Rosalind had received her evening dose before Marin went to bed, that she had recorded the time, signed the entry, and even documented who had prepared the tray. She said that with the blood pressure and respiratory rate she was seeing at that very moment, giving another dose would go against everything she had been taught. She said Rosalind wasn't short on medication. She had too much of it in her system already. Sloane stepped closer. She lowered her voice and said that someone with nothing more than a nursing degree wasn't qualified to argue dosage with a physician, and that Marin should remember who she was in this house. For nearly 2 years, every time Marin had heard words like that, she had lowered her head and obeyed. But tonight there was an old woman breathing shallowly in the bed behind her, and Marin heard herself ask a question in return. She asked who had signed off on the altered dosage on last month's prescription. No one answered. She asked again, her voice never rising, that if Dr. Ashcroft was insisting Rosalind hadn't received her evening dose, then what was she basing that on? Which page of the log? Whose signature? Because Marin had the record right there and was ready to open it immediately for her to see. Sloane didn't answer. Beneath the harsh light of the room, her face didn't change, but the hand holding the syringe lowered slightly. She looked at Marin, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, she truly looked at this woman. Looked at her the way someone looks at something they have kept in the wrong place for far too long. From outside came the approaching wail of an ambulance siren. Sloane turned away, put the vial back into the cabinet, and closed the drawer with a slow, deliberate motion. When the paramedics entered, Marin was the one who gave the report, clearly stating Rosalind's condition, the time of her most recent medication, the readings she had taken, and she spoke with the voice of someone prepared to take responsibility for every word she said. No one asked Sloane for her opinion, and Sloane said nothing more. Inside the ambulance, the overhead lights were stark white, swaying with every turn in the road. Marin sat beside the stretcher with one hand gripping the rail. Rosalind's breathing had returned, though it was still weak. Then the older woman moved. Her left hand reached upward, found Marin's wrist, and closed around it. It wasn't the grasp of someone frightened and desperate for something to hold on to. It was firm, deliberate, her thumb pressing down, the grip of someone trying to keep another person there long enough to say something. Marin bent closer, Rosalind was looking directly at her, her eyes wide beneath the white ambulance lights, so clear and alert that it was frightening. She couldn't speak a single word. She only stared, and stared for a long time, and in that look, Marin understood something that turned her cold inside the moving ambulance. The old woman knew. She had known for a very long time. That same night, more than 400 kilometers east of Chicago, the car carrying Cormac Fallon and Beckett Shaw was heading back toward the city along the Lakeshore Highway. The meeting in Detroit had ended earlier than expected, and the two men had decided not to stay overnight. Beckett was driving. Cormac sat in the front passenger seat, his coat draped over the back of the seat, his phone face down on his thigh because no one had called in the past 2 hours. The road was empty. The lake to their left was black, with no visible boundary between the water and the sky. When they entered the short tunnel on the curve before the turnoff, the overhead lights swept across the windshield in evenly spaced bands of yellow, and that was the last thing that happened normally that night. The truck ahead of them suddenly began to slow down. It didn't slam on the brakes. There were no warning lights. It simply slowed, little by little, taking up the entire lane and leaving no room to pass. Beckett glanced into the rearview mirror and uttered one short word. Behind them, the headlights of a second truck were growing larger very quickly in the mirror, flooding the inside of the car with white light before closing in until nothing remained visible except its grille. Beckett turned the wheel to the right. There was no space on the right, only the concrete wall of the tunnel running parallel beside them, so close they could hear the wind screaming through the narrow gap between the car and the wall. He pulled hard to the left, the transmission growling, and for the next 3 heartbeats the car was trapped between 2 masses of metal moving at the same speed. Then the window on the left shattered. Sound inside a tunnel is unlike sound anywhere else. Every noise came back from the ceiling, the walls, the pavement, piling over itself into one dense roar that the human ear could no longer separate. Beckett shouted at Cormac to get down. Cormac was already down. The car tilted. The front left tire lost its grip. Shards of glass scattered across the dashboard and rattled beneath their feet. Beckett kept both hands on the wheel, and he managed to hold the car steady for another 200 meters before his right arm slipped from the steering wheel and his body sagged toward the door. Cormac lunged across, one hand taking the wheel, the other catching Beckett by the shoulder. The car drifted right, scraping along the concrete wall for a long stretch, with a grinding shriek that followed them through the tunnel, then gradually slowed and came to a stop. The truck ahead accelerated and disappeared. The truck behind them didn't. It stopped a little more than 10 meters away, and 2 figures climbed down and started toward the motionless car, moving quickly, their shadows stretching long in front of them beneath the overhead lights. Cormac Fallon opened the car door and stepped out. What happened next, if anyone ever told the story, wouldn't take long to tell, because it didn't last long. The first man hadn't even managed to close the distance before he was thrown against the side of his own truck and went down. The second man stepped backward once, then again, and the object in his hand fell onto the concrete with a sharp, dry crack before he turned and ran back toward the cab. The truck roared to life and sped away, leaving his partner lying in the middle of the tunnel. Cormac stood beneath the pale yellow overhead lights, breathing evenly, and there was nothing on his face. No anger, no fear, not even the relief of a man who had just escaped death. It was the same expression worn by the man who had calmly cut a piece of meat in a restaurant with its sign turned off on a first snow evening many winters before. He bent down, picked up the object that had fallen onto the road, wrapped it in his handkerchief, then returned to the car. Beckett was still sitting behind the wheel, one hand pressed hard against his opposite shoulder, his face white beneath the tunnel lights, but his mind still clear. Cormac pulled him over into the passenger seat, took the driver's position, and started the car again while Beckett said through clenched teeth not to take him to a hospital. Both men knew why. A hospital meant paperwork. It meant a mandatory call to the police. It meant a name entered into a system before sunrise. A hospital meant that by noon the next day, whoever had been behind those trucks would know exactly who was still alive and exactly where the wounded man was lying. Cormac drove out of the tunnel, left the main highway at the first exit, and followed the dark road along the lake toward the Port District on the south side of the city. He didn't say anything for the entire drive. There was only one question in his mind, and he turned it over and over again. Who had wanted him dead tonight? Who had enough nerve to do it? Who stood to gain if he never made it back to Chicago? He had asked the question wrong from the very first word, but it would be a long time before he understood that. In the passenger seat, Beckett took his phone from his pocket, with the hand he could still move. He didn't call the private physician. He didn't call any of the men who still took jobs at this hour. He dialed one number, and only one. Then lifted the phone to his ear as the lights from the roadside poles swept across his face one by one. Marin's phone vibrated while she was sitting in the hospital hallway with her back against the wall, both hands still carrying the sharp smell of antiseptic. Rosalind had come through the worst of the crisis about an hour earlier, and was now in the observation unit. Marin looked at the name glowing on the screen, a name she had never imagined would call her at an hour like this, and answered. Beckett spoke very briefly. He gave her an address in the Southern Port District, told her he needed her, and told her not to call anyone else. Then the line went dead. Marin stood, found Mrs. Delaney dozing in the waiting room, told her to stay there, then took a car south while the sky was still dark. The place was an old warehouse by the water, with a high ceiling and a rolling door raised only halfway. There was no electricity inside. 3 men stood spaced apart in the corners, and all 3 carried things Marin deliberately didn't look at too closely, because she had learned how not to look at things that weren't her business. Beckett Shaw was lying on a tarp spread across the concrete floor, his head resting on a folded coat. Cormac Fallon was kneeling beside him. Marin set down her bag and asked if there was a first aid kit. One of the men brought over a dented metal box taken from the wall. She opened it, looked through the contents, and saw that most of it had expired long ago. She took out what could still be used, arranged everything in a row on the tarp in the order she would need it, then looked up and began giving instructions. She told the man nearest the door to get clean water, as much as he could find. She told the second man to hold the flashlight at one exact angle and not move it no matter what happened. She told the third to go stand outside the rolling door because there were too many people inside. The 3 men looked at one another for exactly 1 beat, then obeyed, and in that warehouse before dawn, a 27-year-old woman was giving orders to men the entire city knew to step aside for. She turned to Cormac. She took his wrist, pulled his hand into position on Beckett's shoulder, pressed down, then kept her own hand over his for another second, so he could feel the exact amount of pressure. "You hold it here," she said. "Don't let go even if he cries out. Don't let go even if I tell you to do something else. Can you do that?" Cormac Fallon looked at her. In his entire life, the number of people who had ever given him orders could have been counted on one hand, and every person on that hand had been in the ground for years. He said nothing. He simply pressed down and held. She worked beneath the flashlight for more than an hour. She cleaned, compressed, bandaged, raised Beckett's legs above the level of his heart, removed some of his clothing, and covered him with everything they could find inside the warehouse. She talked to him constantly, asking how he felt, forcing him to answer, making him count backward, and every time his voice grew weaker, she called his name louder. Only when his pulse steadied and his skin began to lose some of its coldness did she sit back and wipe her hands against the legs of her pants. Then she told Cormac plainly what she had been thinking for the entire past hour. "I can keep him alive until morning," she said. "Not longer than that. I don't have blood to give him. There's nothing decent in that box, and I don't know what's happening inside him. By morning, you have to choose. Hospital or funeral. You can choose either one, but you have to choose." No one in the warehouse said anything. Cormac nodded once. Near dawn, someone brought tea in 2 paper cups. Marin sat on a wooden shipping crate against the wall, both hands wrapped around the cup for warmth. Cormac sat down on the crate beside her, about an arm's length away. Outside, the black water was beginning to turn the color of lead. He spoke first, and he spoke about his father. He told her that when he was 14, his father had taken him to a freight dock and pointed out a man who was begging, then told him to watch carefully. He said his father had told him that kindness was a luxury, and anyone who bought it had to pay with something else, and that something usually didn't belong to them. He said he had believed those words for more than 20 years, and he wasn't sure he had ever once tried to find out whether they were true. Marin was quiet for a while, then told him about the phone call from that year. She said she had been working a night shift at the hospital when her phone vibrated, and she had silenced the first call because her hands were busy. She said she answered on the 3rd call, standing in the intensive care hallway, and the person on the other end asked whether she was the daughter of those 2 people. She said what she remembered most was that after the call ended, she had gone back into the patient's room and finished her shift until morning, because at the time, she simply didn't know what else there was to do. Neither of them tried to comfort the other. Cormac said nothing about what she had lost, and Marin said nothing about the father who had taught him that philosophy. They simply sat there, each holding a cup of tea that was slowly growing cold, watching the first light creep across the water beyond the warehouse door. And while she sat beside him, Marin realized something she didn't say aloud and wouldn't say for many months afterward. She had seen him in the tunnel that night, through the shattered window, when Beckett called her a second time while she was still on her way. She had seen him step out of the car. She had seen his face in that moment, and what frightened her wasn't what he had done. It was that his expression hadn't changed at all. She drank the last mouthful of tea and couldn't forget it. That morning, Beckett was taken to a private clinic on the west side of the city, a place where no one asked for identification and nothing was entered into a computer. Marin went with him as far as the door, gave a complete account of everything she had done during the night, then went home to shower and returned to the hospital to be with Rosalind. Cormac, meanwhile, didn't sleep. He went back to his study, closed the door, and did the thing people said he did better than anyone else in the city. He didn't call the police. He had never called the police, not because he was afraid of them, but because the police needed warrants, needed jurisdiction, needed time, and he possessed something they didn't. He had people who owed him favors. The first call went to a man at the tax office, someone whose house Cormac had helped save many winters before. "I need everything with my name in it," he said. 10 years. Before noon tomorrow. The second call went to a man at the Port Authority. "Send me a list of every freight company that has ever handled my shipments, including the ones you think I already know about." He saved the third call for last, and made it to a man in his 70s who had kept the books for Cormac's father back in the days when ledgers were still written by hand. Cormac said only one sentence. "Uncle, read this for me. I don't trust my own numbers anymore." Before daylight had fully broken, the documents began arriving. They came by email, through an envelope slipped beneath the door, through a driver who stopped outside the gate for 5 minutes and then left. Cormac spread everything across the long table in his study and sat there all morning with a pencil in his hand. He had built his entire fortune on his ability to see where a contract was lying, so he didn't need anyone to explain the papers to him. By noon, he found it. A freight company whose name he had never heard before. It wasn't large. It didn't handle much cargo. It handled only a small percentage, the same steady amount every month, every year, and it had been doing so for 10 years. 10 years of his money had been flowing through a name he had never once seen on any document he had signed. He sat for a long time with one finger resting on that line. Then he thought about the truck in the tunnel, about the two figures stepping down beneath the overhead lights, and he joined those two things together in the only way a man in his position could have. Someone had been bleeding him for 10 years. That person knew Cormac was about to discover it, so that person wanted to make sure he never returned to Chicago. He believed it completely, and he believed it with all the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about anything that belonged to his own world. He didn't know that he had framed the question incorrectly from the very first word. He didn't know that in the tunnel that night, the man behind the wheel was the one those trucks had come for, because that man had begun asking questions at the Port Authority weeks earlier, and someone had heard about it. It would take Cormac a very long time to understand that, and during that time, he would search in exactly the places someone wanted him to search. That afternoon, he called the man handling the final leg of the trip and canceled everything remaining on his schedule for the week. He had another car brought to him, and he drove it himself. The lakeshore road stretched westward again, the water to his right, changing from lead gray to ash gray, and then to black. And he drove through the night with both hands on the steering wheel, and a single question turning over and over in his mind. Near dawn, he reached the outskirts of Chicago. The city appeared ahead of him in dark blocks of buildings beneath streetlights that were still burning, and he turned toward Astor Street, toward his own house, toward the one place in the world where he still believed he didn't need to be on guard. When Cormac opened the side door, neither woman heard the engine in the drive nor the key turning in the lock. As he stepped into the hallway, snow still resting on the shoulders of his black wool coat and car keys still in his hand, a storm of metal and glass came crashing down on the tile floor of the medication room. He stopped, listening as Sloane's voice carried down the quiet corridor, a flat, sharp voice he had never heard during all the time they had lived beneath the same roof. She said that when his mother came home from the hospital tomorrow, everything had to go back exactly the way it had been. She demanded that from now on, she would keep the care log, and if someone from the hospital called back with questions, only a doctor would be allowed to answer them. Then she stepped closer to Marin, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that Cormac heard clearly as he reached the threshold. Between a doctor and a nurse buried in debt, Who do you think the board is going to believe? That was when he stepped into the doorway, his eyes settling first on the broken glass across the floor, and then moving slowly up to Marin's wrist. And now, with him standing in the doorway of the medication room, with his eyes having traveled once around the room before stopping exactly where they needed to stop, the house fell into a silence that all three people inside it could hear. He didn't shout. He didn't move any faster. He simply placed the ring of keys on the low table beside the door, and the dry sound of metal striking wood carried sharply through the small room. Then he asked, "What did you do to my mother?" He asked it so quietly that Marin, standing less than 2 meters away, needed a beat before she was certain she had heard him correctly. Sloane laughed. That was her first reaction, and it came before she had time to think. She said he had just come back from a long trip, that he was tired, and that this scene looked a certain way but wasn't actually what it seemed. She said Miss Doyle had dropped the instrument tray, that everything had fallen to the floor, and that she was helping her clean it up. She spoke quickly, stacking the sentences one beside another, and not one of them touched the question he had asked. Cormac didn't answer a single word. He only stood there, and he waited. The second layer came when she understood that he wasn't going to say anything until she answered the question he had actually asked. Her voice sharpened. She said the old woman was elderly, that anyone who cared for the elderly knew there came a point when everything began to decline, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. She said Miss Doyle was the one who had pushed the rehabilitation too fast, that everyone had seen it, everyone had said so, but no one had listened. She turned toward Marin and told her to say it, to tell him how many times I warned you. Marin said nothing. She stood with her back against the medical refrigerator, her left arm held tightly against her body, and she looked at Sloane with an expression that held nothing at all. And that was what frightened Sloane most. The third layer was tears. They came quickly, and they were real, because by then they truly were. She said she had lived in this house for nearly 2 years, and hadn't felt for a single day that she belonged in it. She said your mother never let me touch her, not once, but with that woman, she did. She said, do you know what that feels like? Walking past that room every day and hearing laughter inside. Then she said the next thing while she was crying, while she was defending herself, without ever intending to say it aloud. She said she hadn't done anything that terrible, that she had only slowed things down, only slowed them down a little, and the old woman hadn't lost anything. She was still here, wasn't she? The words fell into the middle of the room, and no one picked them up. Sloane heard herself. She stopped crying halfway through, her mouth still slightly open, and all the color drained from her face in the way it does when someone has stepped into a hole of their own making. Cormac didn't ask another question. He took his phone from the pocket of his coat, dialed 3 digits, and spoke into it in the calm voice of a man reporting something that had already happened. He gave the address. He said there was a person with an injury to her arm who needed to be examined. He said there was an incident involving the medication of a patient in the house, and that he wanted someone to come document it. Sloane listened to him, and began stammering that he couldn't do this, that he knew he didn't have to do this, that there were hundreds of other ways. Cormac ended the call and put the phone away. In the doorway behind him, Beckett Shaw had been standing there for some time, one arm still suspended against his chest, his face revealing nothing. He didn't come inside. He only looked at Cormac, and Cormac looked back at him once, very briefly, then shook his head. Beckett nodded and stepped away from the doorway. Both men understood perfectly that some possibility had just passed through that room and been refused. Then Cormac turned toward Marin, and this time his voice changed completely. "Let me see your hand," he said. Sloane Ashcroft was escorted out of the house on Astor Street late that afternoon, while the snow was still falling, and the neighbors across the street were pulling back their curtains to watch. She didn't resist. She walked to the car with her back straight and her chin lifted, and before bending down to get into the rear seat, she looked back toward the side door exactly once. Marin wasn't standing there. She was sitting in the kitchen with an ice pack pressed against her forearm, while a paramedic asked her questions. She answered very slowly, because that arm still had no feeling in it. No one in the house slept that night, but for the first time in months, Marin lay down without feeling as though something heavy were pressing against her chest. She thought the hardest part was over. She was wrong. The first call came in the middle of the following morning. A polite female voice introduced herself as an investigator with the State Board of Nursing, and called to inform Marin that a formal complaint had been filed concerning her professional license. The complaint alleged that she had removed a controlled medication from the medicine cabinet belonging to the patient under her care without authorization. Marin sat down on the staircase. She asked who had filed the complaint. The woman said that information couldn't be disclosed at this stage. Marin asked when it had been filed. The woman paused briefly to check, then read out a date. Marin heard the date, and for a very long moment, there was nothing but silence inside her head. It was a date from many weeks earlier, before the night Rosalind had to be taken to the emergency room, before that afternoon in the medication room, before even the night Marin had sat beneath the desk lamp with the prescription sheets spread in front of her and realized that the numbers had been altered. Someone had filed that complaint at a time when Marin didn't yet know she would ever have to speak up. The second call came less than 2 hours later, and this time the number was from Ohio. The person from the hospital's financial department spoke in the courteous voice people use when delivering bad news about money. Wyatt Doyle's surgery had been scheduled. Everything was ready, but the source of payment had just been declared invalid. The person said the guarantor had withdrawn, the withdrawal had been finalized, and the hospital was required to postpone the procedure until another source of payment could be secured. Marin asked when the guarantor had withdrawn. The person said yesterday. She asked how long remained before the scheduled surgery. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then the person said, 3 days. Marin thanked them, ended the call, and sat motionless for a very long time in the empty kitchen. Everett Kane arrived late that afternoon. He carried his leather briefcase, took off his coat and draped it over the back of a chair, asked Mrs. Delaney about her knees the way he always did, then asked Marin whether she could sit with him for a few minutes. They sat at the kitchen table. He poured water for her first, then poured his own. "I know you've had a difficult couple of days," he said in the same warm voice that hadn't changed since her very first interview. "I've looked over that complaint. It's more serious than you think. When a controlled medication is involved, they don't issue a warning. They revoke the license, and they revoke it permanently. This isn't losing a job. It's losing your entire profession." He opened his briefcase and placed 2 sheets of paper on the table. The first was a check. The amount written on it was greater than what remained unpaid for Wyatt's surgery, greater than both of Marin's loans combined. The second sheet contained only a few typed lines with a blank space left for a signature. It was a letter of resignation. "You sign this," he said, placing one finger on the second page, "and that complaint will be withdrawn within the week. I know people on the board. Then I make one call to the hospital down in Ohio, and the surgery goes ahead on the date already scheduled. Your brother will stand again. I promise you that." He leaned back and folded his hands together on the tabletop. "If you don't sign, then the complaint stays exactly where it is. It goes before the board. You lose your license, and no hospital anywhere in this country will hire someone whose license was revoked for something like that, and there still won't be money for the surgery. I'm only telling you what will happen." Marin looked at him. "You're threatening me," she said. Everett Kane shook his head, and he did it sincerely, almost sadly. "I never threaten anyone," he said. "Threats are for people who aren't certain of their position. I'm simply putting the numbers on the table so you can see them. This isn't a threat, Miss Doyle. It's mathematics." It was the first time in nearly 2 years that he hadn't called her kiddo, and Marin noticed immediately. Marin didn't sign. She told Everett Kane that she needed time to think, and he said, "Of course," leaving both sheets of paper on the kitchen table and telling her to keep them, to call him when she was ready. He buttoned his coat and walked toward the door with the unhurried gait of a man who already knew that call would come. 2 days later, a court-appointed attorney called Marin and said his client wanted to see her. He made it clear that she was to come alone, with no one else accompanying her, and that if she didn't agree, then the meeting simply wouldn't happen. Marin sat motionless with the phone in her hand for about half a minute before saying she would come. The visitation room had a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 plastic chairs. Sloane Ashcroft wore the gray uniform of the detention facility, her blonde hair darker now at the roots, and there wasn't a trace of lipstick left on her face. But she still sat with her back straight. She watched Marin walk in, looked at the brace still supporting her left arm, and didn't offer a single word of apology. Marin didn't wait for one. "Do you know why I hate you?" Sloane said. Those were her first words. "It isn't because he cares about you. I don't care who he cares about. That isn't why I was going to marry him." She stopped and looked down at the 2 hands resting on the metal table, hands that had held surgical instruments in operating rooms for 10 years. "I hate you because you actually do the thing I spent 10 years pretending to do. I wear a white coat. I talk to people in that carefully practiced, gentle voice. I memorize the questions I'm supposed to ask about how they're feeling. But you sit there reading the newspaper to an old woman who can't speak, day after day, and no one pays you $1 extra for it. Every time I walked past that room, I had to remember what I had become. Marin didn't answer. She had prepared herself for many things, but not for that. Sloane looked up. "But that isn't why I asked you to come here," she said. "Were you allowed to bring your phone inside?" Marin said yes. Sloane gave her an email address and a password, reading them slowly, repeating them twice, then told her to open the drafts folder. "I recorded every meeting I had with him," she said, "from the very first one. Not because I was clever, because I was afraid. People only make recordings when they're afraid." The recording was less than 4 minutes long. It began with the scrape of a chair across the floor and the sound of water being poured. Then Sloane's voice came through, and it was a voice Marin had never heard before, trembling and hurried, words running over one another. She said she wasn't doing it anymore. She said the old woman was improving too quickly, truly improving, not the kind of temporary improvement elderly people sometimes had for a few days. She said Rosalind could say people's names now, and if things kept going this way, it would only be a few more months. She said, "You don't understand. I'm a doctor. I know what's happening inside her body, and I'm not doing this anymore. I'm stopping here." Then Everett Kane's voice answered. He didn't raise it. He didn't interrupt her. He waited until she had finished. And when he finally spoke, his voice was just as warm as it had been when he poured water for Marin at the kitchen table, just as warm as when he asked Mrs. Delaney about her knees. "You're talking as though you have a choice," he said. Then he read 3 names. He read them slowly and distinctly, the way someone recites a list they know by heart. 3 names belonging to 3 people, followed by 5 incidents that had occurred at the clinic on Michigan Avenue over 6 years, followed by case numbers, followed by the names of the courts where those cases should have been heard if someone hadn't stepped in and made them disappear. When he finished, he was silent for a moment. "Those 3 families still have lawyers, you know," he said. "I'd simply advise you not to make me remember their phone numbers." After that sentence, no one spoke in the recording. There was only the sound of a chair scraping backward, footsteps, and a door closing. The recording ended there. Marin placed the phone on the metal table. She sat in silence for a long time and realized that her hands had gone cold. She looked at the woman sitting across from her, the woman who had seized her wrist in the medication room, the woman who had watched an old woman lose herself piece by piece for months without saying a word, and Marin couldn't find even the smallest trace of forgiveness inside herself. But she also couldn't find the thing she had carried with her during the entire journey there. "You weren't the one who started this," Marin said. It wasn't a question. Sloane lowered her eyes to her hands. "I've never been the one who started anything," she said. "That's the worst part." Marin arrived home after dark. She didn't take off her coat. She went straight upstairs to her room, knelt down, and pulled the shoebox out from beneath the bed. It was heavier than she remembered. She carried it downstairs to the living room, turned on every light, and sat on the floor. Then she opened the lid. The papers filled the box all the way to the top. She took them out 1 stack at a time and spread them across the floor in front of her, row after row, until a wide stretch of the room was covered in paper. There were more than 500 sheets. On every one of them was a spiral. Some had only 1. Some had 3 or 4 layered over each other. The pen strokes were dark in places and faint in others, continuous in some places and broken in others. And on some sheets the ink had smeared, because Rosalind's hand had been shaking. Marin sat in the middle of those papers and looked at them. She had seen them every day through 2 winters. She had held them, stored them, handed the pen to the woman who made them, and not once had she truly looked at them until tonight. She picked up 1 sheet. The spiral began in the center, moved outward, then ended with a crooked stroke sweeping toward the right. She stared at that stroke. Then she turned the page slightly. She looked at it for a while longer. She set that one down and picked up another, then another. She turned each sheet slowly, without rushing, and her hands began to move more carefully. The shape in the middle wasn't a circle. It had 3 strokes, 3 horizontal strokes, 1 at the top, 1 in the middle, 1 at the bottom, all joined together because that hand couldn't lift the pen from the paper. And there was 1 vertical stroke running down the left side, connecting all 3. Marin set the sheet on the floor. She took 2 more and placed them beside it. Then 4. Then an entire row. She turned every one of them in the same direction. And when she finally looked up and saw the whole row at once, she saw it. It was a letter. It was the letter E. Rosalind had written it with her left hand, her non-dominant hand, the hand that had never held a pen in 68 years, until the day the other side of her body stopped obeying her. She had written it at the end of every afternoon, when the light beyond the garden turned gray, when she knew for certain that only 2 people were in the room. She wrote it one day, then wrote it again the next. She wrote it for 2 years. Rosalind Fallon had taught school for 30 years at an elementary school on the north side of the city, and the first thing she taught every child who entered her classroom was how to hold a pencil and form their first letter. Marin sat in the middle of that floor covered with paper, and she couldn't get up. She heard a sound come from her own throat, one short sound, then raised a hand to cover her mouth. She thought about that first afternoon when Rosalind had held out her hand for a pen. She thought about what she had said then, that the drawing was beautiful, using the gentle voice people so often used with patience. She thought about the look in Rosalind's eyes when she heard those words. She thought about Mrs. Delaney standing in the doorway saying that the previous nurse had put all the pens away, that the old woman never drew anything that looked like anything, that once the pens were gone, she had been restless for about a week and then stopped. She thought about the afternoons when Rosalind had drawn 3 or 4 shapes on the same page, one over another, then pushed the sheet away and demanded another. She thought about the days when her hand shook so badly that the lines broke apart, and how furious she had become. She thought about the fact that for those 2 years, once every day, Rosalind had been calling out that name. She called it while Everett Kane sat beside her bed holding her left hand and telling stories from long ago. She called it while he stood in the hallway afterward, writing notes in his leather-bound notebook. She called it that afternoon when he asked Marin how much longer, at this rate, before the old woman would be able to speak a full sentence. She called it every day for 2 years, calling with the only thing she had left, and not one person in the world understood her. Marin lowered her head. She reached out and straightened one sheet that had slipped out of line, aligning it neatly with the pages beside it. Then she did the same with the next one. Then the next. She sat on that floor for a very long time, straightening each page one by one, and her tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink in several places, and she wiped at them with the sleeve of her coat, but the stains wouldn't come away. Marin carried the shoebox down to the study before dawn. She didn't say much. She placed the box on the desk, took out 3 sheets, turned them all the same way, and pushed them toward Cormac. Then she set her phone beside them and played the 4-minute recording for him. He listened to the entire thing. He didn't ask a single question while it played, and when the recording ended, he sat motionless for a very long time with the 3 sheets of paper in front of him, both hands resting on the desk without moving. Then he thanked her and told her to go upstairs and rest. That afternoon, he called Everett Kane and said he needed to see him at the house. Everett arrived just as the streetlights came on. He removed his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat down in the chair he had occupied in that house for a decade. Cormac poured him a glass of wine from a bottle that had belonged to his father, then poured one for himself, and for about a minute, that was the only thing that happened between them. "What does my boy need to see his uncle about?" Everett asked. "I want to hear you tell it," Cormac replied. "Tell what?" "Tell me about the last 10 years. Everett lifted his glass, turned it slightly in his hand, then set it down without drinking. He didn't ask again. He didn't look surprised. He simply leaned back into the chair and looked at Cormac with the expression of a man who had just heard the exact question he had been waiting a long time to hear. "I came to help manage this house when your father died 10 years ago," he said. "He left behind 4 companies, 2 debts you still don't know ever existed, and a 22-year-old boy sitting in a funeral home. Who sat down with the creditors that night? Who signed the papers that kept the port from being shut down during that first week?" I've never told that story because telling it ruins the point of it, but since you asked, I'll tell you. "I know," Cormac said. "I've never forgotten." "Then you need to know something else too," Everett said. "I kept this family standing for a decade. A decade without one full night of sleep. And when everything had finally settled, what was your mother planning to do? She was going to drag all of it into the light, take that trust authorization with her and find some outside lawyer, tear everything open, and let strangers look inside. Do you understand what would have happened if she had done that? It wouldn't have been me who lost everything. This entire house would have gone down. You would have gone down." "You just mentioned my mother," Cormac said. His voice didn't rise. "You keep saying this was about protecting the house, but you still haven't said one word about the part you took for yourself." Everett didn't answer. Cormac reached into a desk drawer, took out a thick stack of papers bound in a blue cover, and placed it on the desk between them. He pushed it across. "Copies only," he said. "The originals aren't in this house." Everett Kane looked at the papers. He didn't reach for them. He only stared, and he stared for a very long time, much longer than it should have taken him to recognize what they were. In the study, the only sound was the grandfather clock carrying in from the living room. Then he looked up. His face was unchanged. It was still the face of the uncle who had sat in that chair for a decade, who had asked Mrs. Delaney about her knees, who had poured water for guests before pouring his own. "Let me ask you one thing, son," he said. "What are you planning to do with me?" Cormac didn't answer that question in the study. He told Everett to go home, and Everett went, and both men understood that didn't mean the matter was over. 3 days later, when Everett Kane arrived at the parking garage beneath his office building late in the afternoon, 2 cars were already waiting for him. No one raised a voice. No one touched him. Someone simply opened the rear door and waited. And Everett looked around once before, bending down and getting into the seat. There was a storm that night. The rain came first, then the wind. Then thunder rolled across the lake and echoed against the rows of corrugated metal warehouses in the southern port district. The warehouse they took him to was an old one at the end of a dead-end road, so far from the nearest police station that no one would have heard him even if he screamed. There were no streetlights along that stretch. There wasn't a camera mounted on any pole for miles around. Rainwater leaked through the metal roof in streams and ran across the concrete floor, and 2 hanging bulbs had been switched on, their murky yellow light swaying in the wind that slipped through the gaps around the rolling door. Cormac Fallon arrived last. He walked in without saying a word, took off his wet coat, and handed it to the man nearest the door, then stopped about 5 steps from Everett. His men stood in a loose circle along both walls, 7 or 8 of them, and every one of them was silent. Beckett Shaw stood closest to the rolling door, his right arm still in a sling, his eyes fixed on Cormac rather than on the other man. No one needed to say anything. In their world, when a man was brought to a place like this on a night like this, the answer had already been decided. Everett Kane knew that. He stood in the middle of the wet concrete floor, with his arms at his sides, his gray suit darkened by rain across both shoulders, and he didn't beg. He had spent 30 years in this world. He understood its rules, and he knew that once things had gone this far, begging would only strip away what dignity he had left. "I don't blame you, son," he said. Cormac didn't answer. He stood there for a long time. Rain hammered endlessly against the metal roof, the 2 bulbs swung back and forth, and the shadows of the men stretched long across the concrete, shortened, then lengthened again. Cormac didn't reach into his coat for anything. He only turned his eyes toward Beckett. One brief look, the kind of look every man in that warehouse had seen many times before and knew exactly how to read. Beckett pushed away from the wall. Then came the sound of the rolling door being raised a little higher, and footsteps crossing the wet floor. Marin Doyle walked in, her hair plastered to her forehead, her coat soaked through, one arm wrapped around the shoebox against her chest to shield it from the rain. No one stopped her, because no one had been told to stop someone like her. She walked straight through the men, past Beckett, and stopped in the open space between Cormac and Everett. She didn't look at Everett. She turned fully toward Cormac. He said her name once, quietly, and told her to go outside. She didn't. She opened the box, took out one sheet of paper, and held it toward him. He didn't take it right away. "Look at it," she said. He took it. The paper had gone slightly soft from the damp air. On it was a crooked spiral. Trembling lines dark in some places and faint in others, exactly like the hundreds of other pages inside the box she was holding. He had seen it 3 days earlier in the study, and he already understood what it was, but he had never held it in his hand in a place like this. "She wrote this every day for 2 years, Marin said. Her voice didn't rise. "Every day, sir. With the hand she had never used to write before. She had nothing else. She couldn't speak, couldn't walk, couldn't call anyone. This was all she had, and no one understood her. Not even me." She paused. The rain kept pounding on the metal roof above them. "If you do what you came here to do tonight," she said, "there will never be a trial. No one will read the files. No one will say his name in front of other people. They'll say he disappeared somewhere, and after a few years they'll stop talking about him at all. And your mother will lie in that room for the rest of her life, with the name she spent 2 years trying to call out, and she'll never hear anyone say it for her." She raised one hand and pointed to the sheet in his grasp. She's been silent long enough. Don't take that from her, too. No one in the warehouse moved. Cormac Fallon stood there with the paper in his hand, rainwater running from his hair down beneath the collar of his shirt, and he looked at it for a very long time. He didn't look at Everett. He didn't look at Beckett. The 7 or 8 men standing along the walls waited for him to raise his head. Cormac raised his head. He folded the sheet of paper in half, slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, then turned to Beckett and said exactly 4 words. "Call them. Do it now." Beckett didn't ask again. He took his phone from his pocket with his good hand and stepped toward the rolling door, and somewhere inside that warehouse came the faint sound of several men along the walls breathing out, a sound none of them had intended to make. Everett Kane heard it all. He stood motionless in the middle of the wet concrete floor, water still dripping from the metal roof above him, and he didn't beg, didn't bargain, didn't say another word to the man he had called son for a decade. He turned his head and looked at Marin. "Miss Doyle," he said. His voice was still warm. That was the strangest thing of all. That even now his voice was as warm as it had been that afternoon when he poured tea for her in the Fallon living room. "Before they get here, let me ask you just one thing. Did you ever wonder why you were hired into this house?" Marin didn't answer. "You had never cared for a stroke patient before," he said. "Not for a single day. You worked intensive care. You left graduate school unfinished. And there wasn't one rehabilitation certificate anywhere in your file. That day I had 11 applications on my desk. 9 of those people had more experience than you. And yet I chose you. Didn't that ever strike you as strange?" He continued without waiting for an answer, speaking in the even voice of someone explaining an old business decision to a newcomer. "I reviewed the file on your parents' accident," he said. "I looked at it before you ever submitted your application. The truck on the highway outside Columbus, the one that lost its brakes on the downhill grade, it belonged to the fleet of a small freight company. The same company my boy here just printed an entire thick file about." Marin didn't move. "That truck failed inspection," Everett said. "It failed on the braking system. If it stayed off the road, we lost money. And it was peak season. So I made one phone call and paid someone. 3 days later, it had a clean certificate and went back on the road. It was a very small expense, Miss Doyle. I don't even remember the amount. Thunder rolled across the lake outside. No one in the warehouse said anything. Then the compensation file came across my desk," he said. "I read it. Your name was in it. Your brother's name was in it. His medical records were in it. Both times the insurance company denied coverage. The loan you signed after leaving school was there too. I sat there and read all of it, and I thought, there she is. Rosalind was being difficult by then. She had driven off 2 people in 6 months. I needed someone inside that house who would never dare open her mouth. Someone with too much to lose and nothing to fall back on." He looked at her, and for the first time that night, something almost like regret appeared in his eyes. "I chose you because you were desperate, Miss Doyle. That was the only calculation I got wrong in my entire career." Marin stood there. The shoebox was still held against her chest. She could hear the rain on the metal roof, the water running across the concrete, the sound of someone shifting their weight behind her. She heard every one of those things with painful clarity, and inside her own head she heard nothing at all. She turned. She looked at Cormac Fallon, and he was looking back at her, and there was no surprise on his face. There was something else. She held his gaze for another beat, and then she understood what it was. 10 years, she said. "Your money went through that company for 10 years. He didn't deny it. He didn't say he hadn't known. He simply stood there and let the words remain between them, and his silence was the fullest answer he could have given her." Marin turned away. She walked past Beckett, who was speaking into his phone, stepped beyond the circle of light cast by the 2 hanging bulbs, passed through the rolling door, and walked straight into the rain outside. The water soaked her hair at once, soaked her shoulders, seeped into the cardboard box she was still holding against her chest. She didn't run. She walked slowly down the dark, dead-end road between the rows of metal warehouses, one step after another, never looking back even once. Cormac Fallon stood in the warehouse doorway and watched her until her figure disappeared completely into the rain. He didn't call after her. He didn't send anyone to follow. He could have given 100 explanations, and every one of them would have been true. That he had never heard the name of that company, that he hadn't signed a single document connected to it, that for 10 years he had been deceived inside his own business. He stood there knowing that none of those explanations was enough. His father had once taught him that a man was responsible for whatever passed through his hands. For 10 years, that thing had passed through Cormac's hands, and he hadn't bothered to look. Not knowing didn't make him innocent. Everett Kane was taken away sometime near dawn, and the news reached the city before the sun came up. It traveled the way news like that always traveled. Not through newspapers, not through television, but through brief phone calls between people who had reasons to care. By noon, everyone who needed to know already knew. And what they knew wasn't that Everett Kane had been draining money from the Fallon family for 10 years. What they knew was that Cormac Fallon had handed him over to the police. Beckett Shaw said it plainly the following afternoon in the study, when only the two of them were there. He didn't soften it, because the two men had spent too many years beside each other to bother with caution anymore. "Do you know what this whole city is saying?" Beckett said. "They're saying your uncle stole from you for 10 years. You caught him red-handed, and then you called the police. They don't think that was justice. They think you didn't have the nerve." Cormac didn't answer. "From now on, anyone who wants to test you is going to do the math again," Beckett continued. "Before, they figured the price was their life. Now they figure it's a few years in prison, and anyone can survive a few years. You just taught every one of them that calculation, and you taught it for free." The cost arrived over the next 3 weeks. 2 of the men who had stood along the warehouse walls that night resigned, and both of them appeared somewhere else within half a month. A loading contract at the southern docks that the Fallon family had held for 12 years was awarded to another name, and no one even bothered to give advance notice. They simply sent a short letter with 3 lines. 2 meetings were postponed, then postponed again, then quietly disappeared altogether. Calls that once would have been answered within 3 rings now rang until no one picked up. Cormac didn't react. He still went to work, still signed papers, still showed up wherever he was required to be. But everyone around him noticed that he had stopped explaining himself, even to himself. The house on Astor Street felt so empty during those weeks that a person could hear the sound of their own footsteps. Mrs. Delaney had taken leave and gone to stay with her daughter. Sloane's room had been cleared out long ago, and the room at the end of the second-floor hallway, the one with the large window overlooking the back garden, was entered by no one, except the new caregiver who came twice a day and then left. One evening, Cormac went upstairs. He pulled the low chair beside the bed, the chair that for 2 years he had only ever seen one person sitting in. He sat down. Rosalind was awake. She looked at him. He remained silent for a very long time, both hands resting on his knees, and he thought about all the afternoons he had walked past this room on his way to the study. He thought about how many times he had passed the door at exactly the hour when the light in the garden turned gray. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. His voice didn't sound like his own. "You called his name for 2 years. Every day. I was right outside this door. I walked past here every evening. I'm your son, and I didn't understand what you were trying to say." He stopped. "Someone else understood you. Not me." He lowered his head. On the bed, Rosalind's left hand began to move. It searched along the edge of the blanket, then continued toward him, slow and trembling, taking a very long time to cross that small distance. It touched the back of his hand. Then her fingers curled, trying to close around it, and they managed to hold only part of it, but they stayed there and didn't let go. Cormac Fallon sat beside his mother's bed in his empty house, and he didn't move his hand. Marin returned on an afternoon late in the season, 11 days after the rainy night at the port. She didn't call ahead. She stood at the side door with the shoebox tucked under one arm, and when Cormac opened it, she spoke from the threshold without stepping inside. "I didn't come back because I've forgiven you," she said. "I haven't. Maybe I never will. But if I walk away, then the man who took my parents from me wins one more time, and this time he wins by my own hand. I won't give him that." Cormac Fallon didn't argue with a single word. He only opened the door wider and stepped aside. Everett Kane's trial lasted nearly a year. 10 years of financial records were audited from beginning to end, and the thick blue-bound file Cormac had once placed on the desk in his study became the backbone of the entire prosecution. From there, investigators uncovered other things, and one of them was the certification issued for a truck that should have been kept off the road in Ohio many years earlier. The accident case was reopened. This time, no one called it a traffic risk. The Doyle family received the full compensation they should have been given from the beginning, and Marin sat for a very long time with the ruling in her hands, not knowing what she was supposed to feel. The complaint filed with the State Board of Nursing was formally dismissed the following spring. and the written decision contained a line stating that the complaint had been submitted by a person who had no authority to access the patient's medication records. Maren Doyle's nursing license remained intact, without a mark against it. Sloane Ashcroft permanently lost her medical license and received a prison sentence, reduced because of her testimony and because she voluntarily turned over the recording. She didn't appeal. In Ohio, on the morning before Wyatt's surgery, Maren hung her coat on a hook in the waiting room, and a sheet of paper folded into quarters slipped from the pocket. It was a copy of the receipt, showing that the entire cost of the surgery had been paid in full weeks earlier. And under the payer information, there was only one line requesting that the identity remain confidential. She stood in the middle of the waiting room, holding that paper for a long time. She didn't call anyone to ask. She folded it again and placed it in her wallet. 4 months later, in the hospital's physical therapy room, Wyatt Doyle stood between two parallel bars with sweat on his forehead and the stubborn expression that seemed to belong to every member of the Doyle family. Then he let go. He stood upright without holding on to anything. Then he stepped forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. In the waiting area outside, several children playing with blocks on a rug beside the window all looked up at once. They cheered, then clapped, then a little girl ran over and offered Wyatt her water bottle with both hands. The whole room filled with laughter, and Maren stood in the corner with both hands over her mouth, laughing with them while tears streamed down her face. Many seasons later, the old warehouse at the end of the dead-end road in the Southern Port District had its metal roof removed, was rebuilt from the foundation up, and became a non-profit rehabilitation center for people recovering from strokes and spinal cord injuries, open even to those whose insurance wouldn't cover the cost. Cormac Fallon gradually sold off the parts of his business he couldn't clearly answer for when someone asked questions. And before anyone could question him, he said that he was doing it slowly, but he would finish all of it. Beckett Shaw took charge of the center's entire security operation, walking a little more slowly than before, and still never speaking more than necessary. The sign at the entrance bore the name Rosalind Fallon Rehabilitation Center. The opening ceremony took place on a sunny autumn morning. Rosalind sat in a wheelchair in the front row, her silver hair neatly combed, a thin blanket across her legs. When they invited her to cut the ribbon, Maren bent down and placed the scissors in her left hand. Rosalind didn't take the scissors. She took hold of Maren's wrist. Then she lifted her eyes and looked around at everyone standing there, and she spoke. She spoke clearly, every word complete, the first full sentence after all those years of silence. This girl stayed with me. That evening, after everyone had gone home and only the light from the center's lobby remained glowing, Cormac handed Maren a tarnished silver ring. "It belonged to my father," he said. "He taught me that strength meant making people disappear. I believed that for most of my life. You taught me that strength means knowing how to make people stay." The story of Maren Doyle and Cormac Fallon leaves behind something very simple, something many of us spend half our lives learning. Real power doesn't lie in whether we are capable of destroying someone. It lies in the moment when we choose not to, even when there is no one strong enough to stop us. And there is another truth as well. The people who spend their lives caring for everyone else are often the ones no one ever asks whether they are doing all right, but they deserve to have someone stay beside them too, just as they have stayed beside everyone else. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for another human being isn't to heal them. Sometimes it is simply to look a little more closely, listen a little longer, and stay long enough to understand what they have been trying to say while the whole world has passed them by. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue bringing you more compelling stories every day. How did Maren and Rosalind's story make you feel, and what part of it stayed with you the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep in your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.